There comes a moment in life when a deeply feeling person stops being easy to reach, easy to shake, easy to control. Not because they become cold, not because they stop caring, not because they lose their heart. They become untouchable because they finally understand something most people learn too late. Sensitivity without boundaries is self-destruction, and empathy without discernment is an invitation for exploitation. Let's be clear about something. An empath is not weak. An empath is not naive because they love deeply. An empath is not foolish because they believe in people. In fact, the empath often sees more than everyone else in the room. They hear what was not said. They feel the tension beneath the smile. They notice the mismatch between words, tone, and intention. But here is the danger. When you can feel everything, and you have not trained yourself to filter it, you start carrying what was never yours. You carry other people's chaos. You carry their insecurity. You carry their dishonesty. You carry their unhealed wounds. And if you are not careful, you begin calling that compassion, when in reality it is unprotected exposure. That is why this line matters. The line is not physical. It is psychological. It is emotional. It is spiritual. And the moment you cross it, everything changes. That line is this: I can care about you without sacrificing myself for you. The day an empath truly understands that sentence, they stop being easy to manipulate. Because manipulation only works when guilt works. Manipulation only works when confusion works. Manipulation only works when you still believe your value is proven by how much pain you can tolerate. Read that again in your mind. Your value is not proven by how much pain you can tolerate. Some people were never attracted to your kindness. They were attracted to your access. Access to your patience, access to your forgiveness, access to your emotional labor, access to your silence when they cross the line. And the hardest lesson for an empath is discovering that not everyone wants love. Some people want control. Some people want comfort without accountability. Some people want your light, but they do not want to respect the source. This is where transformation begins. The empath becomes untouchable when they stop asking, "How do I keep this connection?" and start asking, "What is this connection costing me?" That is an educational shift. That is an intelligent shift. That is a mature shift. Because mature empathy does not just feel. It evaluates. It asks, is this person honest? Is this relationship reciprocal? Is my nervous system calm or constantly under attack? Do I feel respected or merely used? Am I helping or am I enabling? Now we are no longer talking about blind emotion. Now we are talking about trained perception. And that is dangerous in the best possible way. Because once an empath learns to observe patterns instead of excusing them, the game changes. They notice that apologies without change are performances. They notice that charm without consistency is strategy. They notice that being needed is not the same as being valued. They notice that constant emotional emergencies are sometimes just tools of control. And once they see it, they cannot unsee it. That is the crossing. That is the line. The old empath says, "Maybe I'm overthinking." The awakened empath says, "My body recognized the truth before my mind accepted it." The old empath says, "I just want peace." The awakened empath says, "Peace without boundaries is permission." The old empath says, "I don't want to hurt anyone." The awakened empath says, "I will not keep hurting myself to protect people who harm me." That is not cruelty. That is intelligence with self-respect. Understand this deeply. When an empath becomes untouchable, it does not mean nobody can reach them. It means nobody can own them. Their compassion remains, but now it has structure. Their love remains, but now it has standards. Their generosity remains, but now it has limits. And limits are not punishments. They are instructions. They teach people how to engage with you. They teach people what will not be tolerated. They teach your mind and body that your inner world is not public property. This is why calm becomes your greatest weapon. Not rage, not revenge, not dramatic exits. Calm. Because calm says, "I see exactly what this is." Calm says, "I am no longer available for confusion." Calm says, "You do not get access to me simply because you demand it." Calm says, "My silence is not weakness, it is selection." That kind of calm unsettles manipulative people. Why? Because they survive on reaction. They survive on emotional access. They survive on your urge to explain, defend, rescue, and repair. But once you master stillness, they lose leverage. And here is the educational truth most people never hear. The strongest empath is not the one who feels the most. It is the one who can feel deeply without surrendering clarity. That is mastery. To feel pain without becoming pain. To witness deception without absorbing it. To love without losing identity. To walk away without hatred. To say no without guilt. To remain kind without remaining available. That is untouchable. So if you are standing at that line right now, hear me carefully. You do not need to become harder. You need to become clearer. You do not need less heart, you need more discernment. You do not need to stop caring. You need to stop offering sacred access to people who treat your presence like a convenience. Cross the line. Cross the line where self-respect becomes non-negotiable. Cross the line where peace becomes a requirement, not a reward. Cross the line where your empathy serves your wisdom instead of replacing it. Cross the line where your kindness is no longer confused with weakness. Cross the line where you finally understand. You were never meant to be everybody's emotional shelter while standing in your own storm. The moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable, your life changes, your energy changes, your posture changes, your decisions change, your relationships change, your standards change. And suddenly, the same people who once underestimated you can no longer reach the version of you they controlled before, because that version is gone. In its place stands someone calm, someone aware, someone precise, someone who still has a heart, but now that heart is guarded by wisdom. That is the moment an empath becomes untouchable. Not when they stop loving, but when they stop bleeding for people who never intended to heal. The moment an empath becomes untouchable is not the moment they stop loving, caring, or understanding others, but the moment they finally learn that empathy without boundaries invites emotional exhaustion, manipulation, and self-betrayal. Because many deeply sensitive people grow up believing that being good means always being available, always forgiving, always explaining, and always absorbing the emotional weight of everyone around them. Yet this habit slowly teaches others that their kindness has no limit and their patience has no price. And that is exactly where the danger begins, because the world often rewards strength but tests softness. And if an empath does not learn the difference between compassion and overexposure, they can become a home for people who only arrive to take, not to heal, support, or respect. So the real transformation starts when the empath recognizes a powerful truth. Understanding someone's pain does not require accepting their disrespect, excusing their dishonesty, or carrying the consequences of their choices. And this realization is the line they must cross, the inner line between emotional slavery and emotional mastery, where they stop asking, "How do I keep everyone comfortable?" and start asking, "What is this situation doing to my peace, my clarity, and my self-respect?" And from an educational point of view, this shift matters because it replaces pure emotional reaction with observation, evaluation, and discernment, which are essential skills for healthy relationships, emotional intelligence, and psychological resilience. Since a mature empath learns to read patterns instead of promises, behavior instead of excuses, and consistency instead of charm. And once this happens, they begin to notice that repeated guilt is often control in disguise, that constant crisis can become a strategy for attention, that apologies without changed behavior are only verbal sedatives, and that being needed is not the same as being valued. So they no longer confuse emotional intensity with emotional truth, and this is what makes them untouchable. Not arrogance, not revenge, and not emotional coldness, but calm. Because calm is the language of a person who has finally understood their worth. And when an empath becomes calm, manipulative people lose their usual access points, because they can no longer trigger endless explanations, emotional rescues, or guilt-driven compliance. And what makes this transformation so powerful is that the empath does not become cruel. They become clear. They still care, but now their care has standards. They still listen, but now their listening is selective. They still love, but now their love is protected by self-respect. And this protection is not selfishness, it is psychological responsibility. Because no healthy person is meant to serve as an emotional dumping ground for those who refuse accountability. And one of the most important lessons here is that boundaries are not walls built to punish others. They are filters built to protect truth, energy, and mental stability, which means an empath becomes untouchable the moment they understand that saying no is not rejection, distance is not hatred, silence is not weakness, and walking away is not failure, but wisdom in motion, especially when staying would require them to abandon themselves again. And once this mindset is learned, the empath stops negotiating their value through suffering, stops proving loyalty through endurance, and stops measuring love by how much pain they can survive. Because real love does not demand self-erasure, real connection does not depend on confusion, and real respect does not grow where boundaries are mocked. So the untouchable empath is simply a person who has aligned compassion with intelligence, feeling with structure, and kindness with standards. And that is why crossing this line changes everything. Because from that moment on, they no longer live as an open wound hoping to be handled gently. But, as a whole human being who understands that their softness is sacred, their peace is earned, and their inner world is not available to anyone who refuses to enter it with honesty, responsibility, and care, an empath becomes untouchable at the exact moment they understand that caring for others does not require abandoning themselves. Because for a long time, many sensitive people confuse empathy with endless tolerance, believing that being loving means always saying yes, always giving second chances, always absorbing pain, and always staying available no matter how drained, disrespected, or emotionally burdened they become. This misunderstanding creates a dangerous pattern in which the empath begins to live, as if their role is to heal everyone, carry everyone, and protect everyone's feelings while ignoring their own inner damage. And over time, this can attract people who do not truly value compassion, but instead take advantage of it. From an educational point of view, the major turning point is the development of discernment, which means the empath learns to separate genuine need from manipulation, real connection from dependency, and temporary conflict from repeated disrespect. They begin to realize that understanding why someone behaves badly does not mean accepting the behavior, excusing the behavior, or staying close to the behavior. This is the line that changes everything, the shift from emotional absorption to emotional awareness. Before crossing it, the empath may feel responsible for fixing every broken dynamic and may think leaving, saying no, or creating distance is selfish. After crossing it, they understand that boundaries are not acts of cruelty, but acts of mental clarity and self-protection. They stop measuring love by how much pain they can endure and start measuring relationships by honesty, reciprocity, accountability, and peace. This change does not make them less kind, it makes their kindness intelligent. They still care deeply, but they no longer offer unlimited access to people who repeatedly create confusion, chaos, guilt, or emotional instability. In this sense, becoming untouchable is not about becoming cold, distant, or defensive against the whole world. It is about becoming emotionally educated enough to know that softness without structure invites harm, and that empathy reaches its highest form only when it is guided by self-respect, clear standards, and the courage to protect one's inner world. Once an empath learns this lesson, their power becomes visible in the form of calmness, because calmness is one of the strongest signs that a person has stopped being controlled by the emotional demands of others. Manipulative people often depend on reaction, guilt, urgency, and emotional pressure, but these tools stop working when the empath no longer feels obligated to explain every boundary, rescue every crisis, or defend every decision that protects their peace. This is why the untouchable empath is so difficult to shake. They are no longer operating from fear of disappointing people, fear of being misunderstood, or fear of losing connections that were unhealthy to begin with. Instead, they are operating from observation, pattern recognition, and emotional discipline. They watch what people do repeatedly, not just what they say in emotionally intense moments. They understand that apologies without consistent change are weak evidence, that charm without integrity is unreliable, and that being constantly needed is not proof of being deeply loved. Educationally, this stage represents emotional maturity, because maturity is not the absence of feeling, but the ability to manage feeling without losing judgment. The empath who has crossed this line can still be generous but not gullible, compassionate but not careless, open-hearted but not undefended. They no longer confuse access with intimacy, guilt with loyalty, or self-sacrifice with virtue. Most importantly, they stop abandoning themselves in order to preserve relationships that only survive when they remain powerless. That is what makes them untouchable. Not anger, not revenge, and not emotional withdrawal, but the complete integration of empathy and wisdom. They still have a heart, but now that heart is protected by standards. They still wish people well, but they do not chase, beg, or bleed for acceptance. They know that real love does not demand constant suffering, and real respect does not punish healthy boundaries. At that point, the empath becomes untouchable, because they are no longer available for emotional exploitation. And once a sensitive person learns to honor their own peace, as much as they honor other people's pain, their presence changes, their choices change, and their entire life begins to move with greater strength, dignity, and clarity. An empath becomes untouchable the moment they realize that compassion is not the same as compliance. Because for many sensitive people, the habit of caring too deeply slowly turns into the habit of accepting too much, and they begin to mistake emotional endurance for emotional strength. They listen, forgive, understand, and excuse, often believing that if they can just love harder, stay longer, or explain themselves better, the relationship, situation, or person will finally become healthy. But education begins where illusion ends, and the first hard lesson an empath must learn is that insight into someone's pain does not erase the damage that person causes. Understanding why someone lies does not make the lie harmless. Understanding why someone is angry does not make abuse acceptable. And understanding why someone is wounded does not make it your duty to bleed beside. This is the psychological line they must cross. The line between helping and enabling, between compassion and self-neglect, between emotional generosity and emotional surrender. Before crossing it, the empath is often controlled by guilt, by the fear of disappointing people, and by the false belief that setting limits means becoming selfish. After crossing it, they begin to see boundaries as an educational tool, a form of self-respect, and a necessary condition for healthy connection. They stop asking how to be more lovable to everyone and start asking whether the people around them are respectful, reciprocal, and safe. That shift changes everything, because an empath who begins to evaluate energy, behavior, and emotional cost is no longer functioning only from feeling, but from intelligence, discernment, and mature awareness. Once this awareness develops, the empath starts noticing patterns that were always there but were previously buried under hope, loyalty, and over-explanation. They see that some people do not want healing, they want access. They do not want truth, they want control. They do not want closeness, they want convenience. An empath who has not crossed the line often keeps giving because they think the next conversation will solve everything, the next apology will be real, or the next promise will finally bring change. But the educated empath learns to study repetition, because repetition reveals character far more clearly than emotional speeches or dramatic excuses. They realize that when someone repeatedly drains them, confuses them, blames them, or uses guilt to keep them available, the issue is no longer misunderstanding but pattern. This is where emotional power begins, not in becoming louder, harsher, or colder, but in becoming calmer and more observant. Calm is deeply threatening to manipulation, because manipulation survives on reaction. It feeds on urgency, on emotional panic, on the need to rescue, fix, defend, and explain. The untouchable empath becomes difficult to control because they stop rushing to repair every rupture and stop volunteering themselves as the emotional shock absorber in every conflict. They learn that not every problem belongs to them, not every silence must be filled, and not every wounded person deserves unlimited proximity. Educationally, this represents emotional maturity, because maturity is not about feeling less, but about regulating feeling with wisdom. The empath still has deep sensitivity, but now that sensitivity is directed by standards, and standards change the quality of every relationship, every decision, and every emotional investment they make. This is why becoming untouchable does not mean becoming numb, it means becoming aligned. The empath still cares, still notices, still feels, still understands, but they no longer offer their peace as payment for connection. They no longer believe that love must hurt to be real, or that kindness requires permanent self-sacrifice. Instead, they learn one of the most liberating truths of emotional development. You can be a deeply loving person and still walk away. You can wish people well and still refuse them access. You can understand someone completely and still decide they are not healthy for your life. That is the real transformation. The empath who once absorbed everyone's storms now studies whether a person brings clarity or chaos, sincerity or performance, accountability or excuses. They stop measuring their goodness by how much pain they can survive, and start measuring their growth by how clearly they can protect their energy, values, and mental peace. In practical terms, this means saying no without over-explaining, stepping back without hatred, and ending harmful cycles without waiting for permission. In psychological terms, it means the nervous system finally learns safety, the mind finally chooses truth over fantasy, and the heart finally stops volunteering for suffering in the name of loyalty. That is when the empath becomes untouchable, not because nobody can hurt them again, but because nobody can easily manipulate their empathy against them. They have crossed the line where self-respect becomes stronger than guilt, where clarity becomes stronger than attachment, and where inner peace is treated not as a luxury, but as a non-negotiable foundation of life. An empath becomes untouchable at the moment they understand that empathy is a gift. But unmanaged empathy can become a weakness when it is offered without limits, because many deeply sensitive people are taught to believe that being kind means always being available, always forgiving, and always placing the emotions of others above their own peace. Over time, this creates a harmful pattern where the empath starts confusing self-sacrifice with love, and emotional exhaustion with loyalty. In an educational sense, this is where the first important lesson appears. Caring for someone does not require carrying their chaos. Understanding a person's pain does not mean accepting disrespect, dishonesty, or repeated emotional harm. The line that changes everything is the moment the empath stops seeing boundaries as selfish and starts seeing them as necessary for psychological health. Once that lesson is learned, empathy becomes stronger, not weaker, because it is now guided by clarity instead of guilt, and by self-respect instead of fear. Before crossing that line, the empath often lives in reaction mode, trying to fix every misunderstanding, calm every conflict, and rescue every relationship, even when the cost is their own mental and emotional stability. They may keep giving chances because they believe patience will eventually create change, but repeated patterns reveal more truth than repeated promises. This is why emotional education matters. It teaches the empath to study behavior, not just words, and to evaluate energy, not just intention. When they begin doing this, they notice that some people confuse kindness with permission, and some only value the empath because of the emotional comfort, validation, or tolerance they provide. The empath then learns a powerful distinction between support and enabling. Support helps someone grow, while enabling allows harmful cycles to continue. Once this difference becomes clear, the empath no longer feels responsible for saving everyone, and this greatly reduces the power others have to manipulate them through guilt, urgency, or emotional pressure. The next level of transformation happens when the empath develops calmness, because calmness is one of the strongest forms of emotional power. Manipulative behavior often depends on reaction, confusion, and emotional overload, but calm disrupts all of that. A calm empath no longer rushes to explain every boundary, defend every decision, or prove their good intentions to people who benefit from misunderstanding them. Instead, they become more observant, more selective, and more disciplined in where they place their time, care, and attention. Educationally, this represents emotional maturity, because maturity is not about feeling less, it is about managing feeling wisely. The empath still feels deeply, but they no longer absorb everything they feel. They learn that another person's bad mood is not automatically their responsibility, that someone else's wounds do not give them the right to wound others, and that peace is not something to earn after suffering, but something to protect from the beginning. This is the stage where empathy becomes intelligent and no longer operates without structure. Becoming untouchable does not mean becoming cold, distant, or incapable of love. It means becoming emotionally safe within oneself. The empath still cares, still understands, and still wishes well for others, but they no longer trade their inner peace for temporary approval, unhealthy attachment, or one-sided relationships. They learn to say no without guilt, to walk away without hatred, and to remain kind without remaining accessible to those who repeatedly misuse their kindness. This final lesson is the most important one. Self-respect is not the opposite of compassion. It is the foundation that keeps compassion healthy. Once an empath fully understands this, they stop measuring their worth by how much pain they can survive, and start measuring their growth by how clearly they can protect their values, energy, and peace. That is what makes them untouchable. Not pride, not anger, and not emotional shutdown, but the ability to love without losing themselves, to give without emptying themselves, and to stand firm without needing to be understood by everyone around them.